When you think of Romans, you want to think of a very militaristic society. They prided themselves on being warlike, but also almost a sense of righteousness. They weren't necessarily purely violent or purely hostile, though they could be fairly hostile. They had a sort of a sense of righteousness based on their own real and mythological past. They had a certain pride in the Republic, which you've already discovered. And I spoke about augury, how they stay right with the gods. And I was really impressed how many of you understood that with Augustus, that understood how important divination is just to make it look like you have the approval of Jupiter or Zeus. So let's start off here. Augury. We already know about augury. Maybe someday I'll perform a live demonstration of augury in a class. It's very fascinating material. There are many ways to do it. You can read birds. You can read the sacred chickens. You can read a bisected liver. And what's interesting about all these forms of divination is that they go all the way back to the Babylonian methodology of divination. So the Greeks and the Romans used very similar methods for asking the gods for favor. And if we go back and really look at the Babylonian period, we can tell that they got those from the Babylonians. And maybe the Babylonians got it from the Sumerians. It may go all the way back to Sumeria, for all we know. Very fascinating. So when you go into war, even if you're a malicious Roman, murder is still an act of pollution, like we discussed in the Athenian law courts. So you can't just go out and murder somebody in the name of Rome and have it justified. You're still going to carry around a little bit of that miasma, that pollution, or what have you. So even in times of war, since the very beginning, when soldiers would go out and fight, they would need to be cleansed before they re-entered the city. They wouldn't want to bring that, we would call it maybe sin these days. We wouldn't want to bring that murderous pollution back into the city. So they would often perform rituals, and this is nothing special for Romans, but they were very austere and very ritualistic. They took pride in not only divination, but the spiritual cleansing after a battle. Now, one of the temples in Rome, a part of it still stands. One of the oldest temples is the Temple of Janus, also known as the Temple of Janus. Remember that the Romans didn't have a J sound. The J's that you see in any Latin word is usually an I. So instead of Julius Caesar, it's Iulius Caesar. Sounds weird to our English ears, I imagine. But this Temple of Janus it's actually a small temple, and it has an archway that runs through it. So it has a door on either end. You enter in one way, exit out the other. The god Janus himself is a double-faced god, and you see this in a lot of Roman coins. You see a double face, and here's your coin. It's kind of one of the neater gods, I think, The Temple of Janus really early on was associated with the idea of past and future. The head looks both ways. It sees the past, it sees the future. But when soldiers, many historians think real early on, the Temple of Janus was used for cleansing soldiers. You go in one end of the temple and you exit the other, and you are cleansed by the time you leave. That tradition carried on, and so in times of war, the Temple of Janus, the gates are open. In times of peace, like during almost the entire reign of Augustus with his Pax Romana, the gates were closed the entire time. So it's very fascinating. There are physical temple locations that change depending on if its people are going to war or not. So it was a sort of a spiritual aspect. So augury before you go into battle, cleansing after you go into battle. It's tied up with spiritualism. Or let's just say religion. I don't know if spiritualism is a good word for that. All gods lead to Rome. That's my phrase. And evocatio. Now, evocatio, good Latin word. It's usually used meaning to recruit troops. But in our sense, it's a term that's used for recruiting gods. So, in terms of divination, augury. If a general goes out, let's say there's a hill, and all the troops or the general, they amass on the hill right here. And on this other hill is the city that you're getting ready to sack, pillage, or what have you. And what this general will do, either the general or say some sort of priest or augur that the general has with him, what they'll do is they'll create a ritual called Evocatio, where they will communicate with the main god of the city. Doesn't matter what god it is. Romans are not prejudicing its gods. They'll help any god, please any god, as long as that god will please them and help them. The Romans, you could say they're a very holy type. They're holy. Not in the modern Christian sense, because you can't say holy and be a murderer at the same time, but Romans, with their religion, they could. And so we have augury, the cleansing after battle, but we also have evocatio. So what happens is the general will address the god of the city and entice the god of the city. Because remember, ancients at this time believed that we please the gods by blood sacrifices mainly, but also little things like singing and other dedications and oath and, you know, dedications of little hot cakes at a shrine. But blood was the real factor with pleasing the gods. And so any major city would perform sacrifices, their blood sacrifices, and everybody would just eat the meat. It's not like the meat was wasted, I'll have to point out. But sacrifices are being made all across the ancient world to please the gods, especially places like Rome. They're really into pleasing the god and making sure they don't mess up. But they do that for their enemies' gods as well. In our world, when we think of an enemy's god, we would like to reject that god and say that that god doesn't exist, or it's just a demon in godly form. But no, the Romans weren't about that at all. They didn't have a problem with any religion until the Christians came along, actually. Those troublemakers. And with evocatio, you address that god in sort of a ritualistic manner, and you have certain things that you say, but essentially what you're telling that god is that if you move from your city that you protect, and you stop protecting these people, and not only stop protecting these people, but give them fright and terror so they leave the city, so they just abandon the city, what we will do for you is we will triple the amount of sacrifices we make to you in our city. We will move your temple and statues to Rome, which they literally did. And that's why I say all gods lead to Rome. It's that they would take the temple, move it to Rome, and really actually the state would pay to have sacrifices performed to please those gods. So they really thought they were doing something, and maybe this just boosts morale of their troops by sort of weakening your perception of whether or not these people are right with their own god or not. But Romans were very clever. They would take your god and move it to Rome. I think it's very interesting how this happened with mystery traditions in general. They became really hot in Rome, like Christianity, for example. Rome was kind of the center of the Christian world for a long time. So evocatio, recruiting a god. Romans also had a sense of